Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes, and if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. So let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the rooftops of Athens, painting the marble pillars of the Acropolis in a soft amber glow. Roosters crowed from courtyards tucked between narrow stone alleys. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. And from a modest clay-walled home not far from the potter's quarter, a man stirred from his woven mat, stiff from another night on the hard floor. His name was Demos, named for the people. Though in this city of philosophers and warriors, his role was humbler than either. He was a potter. Not famous, not powerful, but like thousands of Athenians, he was a thread in the vast tapestry that was classical Athens. He sat up, stretching arms hardened by years of labor, and listened for a moment. The voices of neighbors were already rising through the courtyard, a woman sweeping her steps, a boy calling out to chase a chicken. The splash of water as someone filled a jar at the communal fountain. There were no alarm clocks in ancient Athens, only sunlight sounds and instinct. And today, like every day, there was work to be done. His wife Myrene was already awake, kneeling near the hearth. She stirred a clay pot of barley porridge, the thin scent of wheat and ash filling the small room. Their son, little Pyrrhion, only 6, rubbed his eyes beside her, his curly hair a wild halo of sleep. Demos smiled and ruffled the boy's head, kissing his wife gently on the temple. No words were needed. There was routine, and there was rhythm. That was the way life flowed in Athens, especially for those without silver in their palms or titles before their names. He dressed simply chiton, tied loosely at the waist, worn sandals that had walked every alley from the Dippolon Gate to the Pnyx Hill. His hands, cracked and blackened from kiln ash, pulled a wooden cart from the corner of their home. Inside, covered with cloth, were 6 freshly fired amphorae, their reddish sheen still warm from yesterday's baking. One was etched with vines, another with the crude image of a satyr playing the aulos. Not masterpieces, but solid work that might buy food or wood, or maybe even a treat for the boy. As he stepped out, the city was truly waking. Merchants pulled open their stalls near the agora, shaking off morning dew. Dogs darted between columns. Priests passed in pairs, murmuring prayers to Apollo or Athena. The Acropolis loomed above them, all serene and silent, like a god watching its children scurry below. He made his way down the winding path toward the agora, the heart of the city. Here stone-paved plazas stretched wide, flanked by porticos and statues. Philosophers gathered under fig trees to debate the nature of justice. Citizens lounged near the stoas, sipping watered wine and discussing yesterday's assembly. Fishmongers shouted prices for their morning catch. The stench of olive smoke and bodies mingled into a single scent, the smell of life. Demos found his usual spot near the edge of the square beneath a statue of Hermes, god of trade. He laid out his wares on a simple cloth and leaned back against the wall, squinting at the crowds already forming. There were tourists from the islands, slaves running errands, and sharp-tongued old men watching everything with eyes like owls. He nodded to a nearby seller of honey cakes, who waved back with a grin and tossed him half of a fig. Time passed slowly. He bartered with a merchant's wife over an oil jar. She wanted it for half a drachma, but he held firm. Another man, a soldier with a crutch and a grizzled beard, bought 2 cups for his sister's wedding. They shook hands, and Demos slipped the silver coin into a pouch at his belt. There was no luxury in his trade, but there was honesty. He shaped things from clay, and in return, life gave him just enough to survive. At midday, the agora quieted as the sun reached its zenith. The stones underfoot grew hot, and Deimos retreated to a shaded arch, sipping lukewarm water from a leather flask. From here, he watched life in full motion, a boy chasing pigeons, a man accused of theft, arguing with a magistrate, two women whispering gossip as they picked over linen. He saw a small procession of young girls in white robes passing by, singing hymns as they brought offerings to the temple of Artemis. He wondered if one day his own daughter, if he ever had one, might join such a parade. But that dream was for another time. The day was not over. In a few hours, he'd need to return home, check the clay he had soaking. Perhaps begin shaping a new order for a tavern up the hill. Then there would be supper storytelling with Parion and the ritual pouring of wine to the household gods. Another day would come, another cart to pull. But for now, under the Athenian sky, Deimos breathed in the dust and laughter of his city, and felt in his own quiet way like he belonged to something eternal. As the sun began its slow descent behind the Athenian hills, the temperature softened, and the blinding white of the agora gave way to softer hues. Deimos wiped the dust from his hands, and began packing up what remained. 2 amphorae were left unsold, but he wasn't disappointed. He had traded one for a wedge of goat cheese and another for a small sack of lentils, practical currencies, in a city where the agora often traded in needs rather than wealth. He rolled his cart through the thinning crowds past the open-air stalls and the gossiping elders perched like ravens along the portico steps. He turned down a side path toward his district, a less polished part of the city, where artisans lived in modest homes and neighbors knew one another by name. Children ran barefoot across the dusty lanes, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the communal oven. A woman with streaks of gray in her hair waved to Deimos from across the street. Her name was Thaleia. She had lived there since his boyhood, and now spent her days telling everyone else how they should live theirs. "You look tired, Deimos," she called with a smirk. "Only 5 pots sold today." 6, he corrected, flashing a grin. "But I won't be rich until my clay sings like marble." "You'd better hope it doesn't. Marble doesn't feed children." He laughed and continued on the creaking wheels of his cart, a familiar soundtrack in the waning light. Back at home, Myrene was grinding barley near the hearth. Parion sat cross-legged with a neighbor boy, both carving wooden animals with dull knives. The walls of the house were still warm from the day's sun, and the scent of herbs and smoke filled the air. Deimos leaned his cart against the doorway, kissed his wife's cheek, and placed the cheese and lentils on the table like offerings. A feast, he said, with mock grandeur. Dinner was simple, as it always was: barley mash, olives, a sliver of cheese, and watered wine. They ate sitting on the floor knees, touching, sharing quiet laughter between bites. Deimos listened as Parion proudly described the battle he had fought with his wooden dog against a cyclops, his friend Sandal. "You should have seen it, father. I cut off its head." Myrene smiled as she ruffled the boy's hair, and Deimos let himself forget for a moment the weight of taxes, cracked fingernails, and a back that ached with every cart pull. But Athens never truly slept, and neither did the minds of its citizens. As dusk deepened, Deimos stepped outside and made his way up the slope toward the Pnyx. Word had spread that there would be an open gathering, not a formal assembly, but a meeting of neighbors and freemen to debate a recent tax levied on the Potters' Guild. These informal discussions happened often, and while they held no legal weight, the right words spoken in the right ear could ripple through the whole polis. The crowd was already forming by the time he arrived. Lanterns flickered along the worn stone steps, casting golden light on weathered faces. There were no senators here, no generals, just farmers, smiths, cobblers, and shopkeepers, all with opinions louder than their means. A man named Antiphon was already speaking red-faced and furious. They tax the potters, while the landowners drink foreign wine and complain about their view of the Piraeus. Where's the justice? Where's the democracy? A murmur of agreement swept the crowd. Deimos listened, his arms crossed. He wasn't a natural speaker. He didn't quote the poets or carry a lineage that gave weight to his words. But his hands were calloused, and he had never missed a vote, not when he was of age, not even during the plague. When his turn came, he stepped forward. I shape clay with fire, and hands, not words, he began. But I know this: when the kiln breaks, the potter starves. If we bleed the workers who will build the ships, who will supply the oil for your lamps? The walls of this city weren't made from taxes. They were made by us. There was no applause in Athens, only nods and sharp eyes. But that was enough. As the crowd thinned, a few men clapped him on the shoulder. "Well said, Deimos. You should speak more often. The city needs voices like yours." He smiled, humbled, though inside he felt the same gnawing uncertainty. Words were one thing. Change was another. He walked home slowly, beneath the stars. Athens glowed in the distance, temples bathed in moonlight, the hum of conversation still echoing in the alleys. He passed a shrine to Hermes and dropped in a small coin, one of his few. For luck. For protection. For whatever god still listened to men like him. When he returned home, Parian was asleep, curled into his mother's side. Myrene looked up from her weaving and raised an eyebrow. "You spoke again, didn't you?" He chuckled. "Only a little." She shook her head, but smiled. "You'll end up in trouble one day trying to fix the world." Maybe he said, lying beside her on the mat. "But until then, I'll keep shaping pots." They lay there in the dark, listening to the wind. Outside, the city breathed loud, chaotic, proud. But inside, for now, there was peace. Tomorrow would bring clay and fire debate, and duty life and uncertainty. But for tonight, Deimos was simply a man with his family beneath the stars of Athens. The first chirps of birds echoed through the cracked roof tiles before the sun even touched the horizon. Deimos stirred in his sleep body, sore from labor, and spine stiffer than stone. He blinked at the faint blue light that bled into the room and sighed another day, another cart, another fire to feed. But before he could rise, there was a pounding at the door. 3 knocks, fast. Sharp, urgent. Not the kind of knock that came with good news. He threw on his chiton and stepped out to see Damon, the baker, from across the square, breathless, eyes wide. "It's Thalia," he said. "She's been robbed." Deimos blinked. "What?" "Her home ransacked. In the night. They say someone broke in through the back and took her coin box and a necklace from her late husband. She's asking for the neighborhood to gather." Word traveled fast in Athens, especially in the quarters where people lived elbow to elbow. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered outside the aging woman's home. Thalia stood at her doorway, eyes red, but unbowed her wrinkled hands, trembling slightly, as she explained what had happened. "I was asleep," she said. "Didn't hear a thing. But when I woke, the chest was open. My husband's seal is gone. And the necklace. It's all I had left of him." The people murmured sympathy, anger, speculation. Some pointed fingers in the air. Others questioned whether it might have been one of the itinerant workers who passed through the district from the docks. But then a younger voice cut through the crowd. "I saw someone," the boy said, "Nikos, the tanner's apprentice. Late last night. I was fetching water. Someone near Thalia's door. I think it was your friend Deimos, the one who helps with your kiln sometimes." A cold knot tightened in Deimos's gut. He knew who the boy meant. Miletos, a quiet young man who'd recently begun helping him fire pots for a few obols a week. He had no family, no steady trade, but worked hard and asked for little. Demos had taken a liking to him. But this... Before long, Miletos was dragged before the crowd, wide-eyed and stammering. I swear, I didn't take anything," he pleaded. "I was passing through, that's all. I sleep near the fountain. I never went inside." Thaleia looked at him with equal parts pain and fury. "Then why was the necklace found beneath your sleeping mat?" Gasps rose. Someone had indeed retrieved the necklace, muddy but intact. Miletos fell silent. His eyes darted desperate, cornered. Demos felt a surge of conflict. Was this justice? Was this enough to condemn a man? In Athens, guilt was determined by a jury of citizens drawn by lot from a pool of volunteers. Trials were public and swift. And this, though informal, would end with either a formal accusation or a mob's judgment. "I vouch for him," Demos said, suddenly stepping forward. "I don't know how the necklace got there, but I know this boy. He's never stolen a scrap of bread from my table." A murmur followed some supportive others, skeptical. "Friendship blind," someone muttered. "I say we vote," said Damon. "We bring it before the magistrate if we must." But Thalia raised a trembling hand. "No," she said. "I've known Demos since he was a boy. If he believes the boy is innocent, then I will let the gods judge." A stunned silence followed. Demos stepped beside her, bowing his head. "You honor me," he said quietly. Later that morning, he walked with Miletos back toward the kiln. The younger man hadn't said a word since. At last, he asked, voice low, "Why did you speak for me?" "You don't know I'm innocent." Demos stopped. "No, I don't. But I know what it's like to be poor. And I know this city devours men like us. Sometimes all we have is someone who believes we're better than the worst thing we've ever done." Miletos nodded, but didn't speak again. Back at the workshop, Demos relit the coals, his hands moving out of habit. Clay waited. Life continued. But inside, something had shifted. Athens was a city of philosophy and democracy, yes, but also one of suspicion and fragile mercy. By midday, the neighborhood had resumed its rhythm. The agora buzzed again with voices and sandal steps, oblivious to the moral storm that had just passed in one quiet lane. Demos sold 2 more amphorae, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched Miletos sweep ash from the kiln floor, silently, diligently, as if trying to erase more than just soot. In the evening, Parion asked about the crowd. Was there a fight, he said, eyes wide. Did the gods come down? No, Demos said gently, but maybe they were watching. And as twilight fell once more over the temples and terraces of Athens, Demos sat outside with his wife and son, staring at the stars. His heart was tired, but steady. His city was imperfect, but home. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again. More clay, more fire, more questions without answers. But for now, the night was still, and he was not alone. The scent of olive oil and smoke clung to the morning air, thick and fragrant. It wasn't the usual smell of the kiln or the bakery. It was sacred, older, heavier, with meaning. Today was not just any day in Athens. It was the beginning of Anthesteria, the festival of Dionysus, a time when citizens honored the god of wine rebirth and the thin veil between the living and the dead. Demos awoke earlier than usual, stirred not by duty, but by tradition. His wife Myrene was already preparing a small garland of ivy and laurel. "Wear this," she said, pressing it into his hands. "You're not just a potter today. You're a son of Athens." He smiled, humbled by the weight of it all. The streets were alive with motion as he joined the procession. Children skipped barefoot ahead, their heads crowned in flowers, laughing in delight. Priests in long robes carried amphorae of new wine, their steps solemn. And at the center of it all, the statue of Dionysus, ornate, smiling, strangely lifelike, was rolled on a decorated cart toward the temple. Everyone, rich and poor alike, joined in the walk. For this day at least, the divisions of society blurred. Demos marched alongside merchants and poets' slaves and senators, all equal before the gods. Drums thudded low in the distance, and flutes wailed like birds in heat. They arrived at the sanctuary near the base of the Acropolis, where smoke already twisted into the sky. The sacrificial altar darkened by years of fire, and blood stood ready. A piglet washed and adorned with ribbons was brought forth. Deimos looked away as the priest's knife flashed. It wasn't the death that unsettled him. It was the silence that followed, as hundreds of people watched the steam rise from the offering, waiting for the god's invisible nod. Ashes drifted in the air. A murmur of prayers, half whispered and half hoped, followed. For health, for good harvest, for favor in war, for the strength to keep going. Demos knelt briefly, pressing a hand to the dirt. For Parion, he whispered, for his future. The ritual ended, and the people dispersed, slowly lingering to drink, to sing, to laugh. At the edge of the temple grounds, Demos spotted an old friend, Nicandros, once a fellow potter, now half-blind from years of working near hot fires. They embraced like brothers. "You still making clay gods?" Nicandros asked. Only the ones who pay Demos replied with a grin. They sat beneath an olive tree, sharing a small cup of wine, passed between calloused hands. The conversation shifted from families to politics to philosophy. Nothing was off limits in Athens. "You ever think," Nicandros asked, "that the gods don't listen? That maybe we pour our prayers into the wind for nothing?" Demos paused, staring at the red-streaked sky. Maybe. But even if they don't listen, we do. We come together. We remember we're more than mouths to feed. Nicandros nodded. That's something. The sun climbed higher, and the wine made their tongues looser, their laughter louder. Eventually, Demos rose to leave. "There's work still," he said, stretching his back. "The gods may rest, but clay doesn't shape itself." He returned home lighter somehow. Not drunk, but soothed. There was power in tradition, in standing among many, and remembering that you are small, but not alone. Back at the workshop, Parion was helping Myrene pound ochre into powder. "Can I come next year?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "When you're old enough to pour the libation," Demos said. "But I can pour now." They laughed together, and Demos tousled his son's hair. Then he knelt beside him, serious for a moment. "It's not about the wine," he said. "It's about what you offer with it." That night after dinner, Demos stepped outside once more. The stars were sharp and clear above the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, music still played. He closed his eyes and imagined the gods listening not from high Olympus, but from just beyond the clouds, curious, amused, perhaps even grateful. He didn't know if Dionysus had truly accepted their offering, but he knew this something had stirred in him. A reminder that life, however hard, was still sacred, still beautiful. And tomorrow, when the wheel turned again and the fire roared to life, he would return to the clay, not just to make pots, but to make meaning. The sun had climbed to its zenith by the time Demos dusted off his hands and rinsed the ochre from his fingers. Myrene handed him a small pouch with a nod, and Parion, his son, stood beside her, looking up with curiosity. "To the assembly?" the boy asked. Demos nodded. "Yes, it's my day." In Athens, democracy wasn't just a word carved on temple stones. It was lived, breathed, argued, fought for. Every eligible male citizen had the right to vote, to speak, to shape the fate of the city. And today, like every 8 days, the assembly was called to gather at the Pnyx, a steep hill overlooking the agora, crowned with a flat platform where voices rose like thunder. The path to the Pnyx was alive with tension. Rumors buzzed in the streets. Sparta was moving again, and war might not wait until the grain ships arrived from Egypt. There was also talk of new taxes, of changing leadership among the generals, and whispers about corruption at the port. Demos walked with a steady pace, the pouch bouncing at his side inside it, a smooth stone token proving his right to speak. He wasn't a politician nor a philosopher, but he was a citizen. That was enough. He passed philosophers gesturing wildly in debate, merchants lobbying for trade protections, and elderly men recalling speeches from Themistocles with glassy eyes. But atop the Pnyx, surrounded by limestone and sky, everything was stripped bare. Here, each man stood alone, his voice, his conviction, and the will of the polis. The herald called for silence, and the presiding officer elected by lot that very morning opened the session. Today's matters, he announced, include the renewal of military funding, the proposal for increased grain tariffs, and the motion to ban foreign performers during festivals. Groans and cheers followed. Demos listened, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a hand raised. When the question of military funding came up, he stepped forward. His voice shook at first, then steadied. "My brothers," he began, "I am no general. I do not hold a sword. But I have 3 neighbors who marched to Amphipolis and did not return. I ask you not to send more until you know why. I ask you to wait, to listen to mothers and wives who feed this city while their men lie buried far from home." There was a pause, not of silence, but of respect. A few nodded. Others muttered. But the words landed. That was what mattered. As the debate continued, Demos took a seat beside a farmer named Euthimios. They didn't know each other well, but shared bread and opinions easily. They laughed at the absurdity of the third motion. Why ban foreign performers when they brought joy to the festivals? This city survives because we let minds collide. Euthimios said, "Not because we shut them out. Votes were cast by raising hands, counted by volunteers. Not everyone got their way." But all had been heard. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the hills, Demos made his way home, tired but full. Not victorious, but included. At the doorstep, Pyrrhion ran to meet him. "Did you speak today?" "I did." "Did they listen?" Demos smiled. "Some did. That's enough." Myrene set down a bowl of lentils and a slice of fresh bread. "So will we be going to war again?" Demos sat heavily on the bench. "I don't know. But if we do, it won't be because we were silent." Later that night, he stood in the doorway, watching the stars appear one by one. Somewhere behind those stars, gods plotted, mortals prayed, and empires rose and fell. But here in Athens, on this hill, among clay pots and shouting voices, a potter had stood and dared to shape, not just earth, but the course of a nation. Tomorrow would bring more clay, more fire, more sweat. But for now, Athens slept. And Demos, the potter, the citizen, the father, he was at peace. The son. The next morning came slowly, painting the whitewashed walls of Athens in soft amber. Demos stirred in his bed limbs, heavy not from physical labor, but from the weight of thought. Yesterday's gathering at the Pnyx still echoed in his mind. Words exchanged, gestures, noticed the hush that followed his brief moment of courage. It was not every day a potter's voice joined the din of the polis. And yet life marched forward. The gods were not swayed by speeches alone, and neither were mouths fed by civic duty. His shop needed tending. Myrene had already begun organizing the new shipments of clay. Parion was helping dragging the sacks with exaggerated groans that made his father smile. Demos stepped into the workshop and inhaled the familiar scent, damp earth-charred wood, and the ever-present hint of smoke that clung to the rafters. The kiln was cold now, but soon it would roar again. Today, though, was not about routine. Today, Anticles was coming. Anticles, the wealthy landowner patron of half the agora, and a man who believed coins were louder than conscience. He was one of Demos's longest clients, a man who demanded his amphorae be fit for an emperor, but never paid a drachma more than necessary. Still in a city where fortunes shifted like sand, his orders kept food on many tables. Demos had prepared the latest commission with extra care, 4 large amphorae bearing scenes from Homer's Iliad, painted with meticulous detail. He had even included a personal touch, an image of Hector embracing his son Astyanax, knowing that Anticles had recently lost a young nephew to illness. Whether the man would notice was another matter. The moment Anticles arrived, the mood shifted. His servant stepped ahead to announce him as if the small shop were a royal court. He entered with robes too fine for clay-stained floors and an expression that suggested even sunlight was beneath him. Demos bowed slightly. Anticles. Welcome. Anticles' eyes swept across the amphorae. The handles are thicker than I requested, he said flatly. Demos remained calm. Thicker, yes, but stronger. The last batch you sent broke in transit. Anticles raised an eyebrow. Is that your fault, or the fault of those who carry them? Does it matter if the result is the same? Demos replied carefully. A pause, then a smirk. You've learned to speak like a man who's stood at the Pnyx. Demos didn't answer. Silence could be sharper than any retort. Anticles circled the amphoraes, trailing a finger over the painted surface. When he reached the image of Hector and Astyanax, he hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition. Perhaps even pain, but it passed as quickly as it came. They'll do, he said. Will you be paying today? Demos asked more boldly than usual. Anticles glanced toward his servant. Phaelon will arrange it. Next month. Demos sighed inwardly. The gods may strike down liars, but they took their time with debtors. As Anticles departed, Myrene appeared from the back, wiping her hands. One day she said that man's silver tongue will choke him. One day, Demos echoed. But today, we still eat. Later that afternoon, as the amphorae were carted away, Demos decided to step outside and clear his head. The agora was bustling as always, a sea of robed sandals shouting merchants and curious children. At the edge of the marketplace stood a familiar figure, an old friend Phaelon, once a fellow potter, now stooped and shaking with age. Phaelon Demos called. You're still upright, so the gods haven't taken you yet. Phaelon laughed, coughing afterward. Not yet. I think Hades lost my name on his scroll. They walked together slowly past stalls of olives, wine scrolls, and sandals. Phaelon talked of the old days of how they once raced clay carts down narrow alleys of the fire that nearly destroyed their kiln during the Archon riots of the time they sculpted a statue of Athena, only to watch it collapse under its own weight. You remember her? Phaelon asked, eyes distant. That girl who used to sell figs near the well. Long black hair, always barefoot. Demos nodded. I married her. They both laughed. Their path took them toward the Stoa of Atalos, where a group of young men in crisp chitons were arguing under the direction of an elderly teacher. A lesson in rhetoric, no doubt how to convince others that black was white, and cowardice a form of wisdom. Words, Phaelon muttered, can build cities, but they can burn them too. Before they parted, Phaelon placed a hand on Demos's shoulder. You speak well now. Don't stop. This city needs voices like yours, ones that know the taste of dirt and sweat. As dusk settled, Deimos returned home with fresh bread and a quieter heart. Perion was reading a scroll by the hearth, and Myrene was stitching a tunic. The amphorae were gone. Anticles' coin had not arrived, but something had shifted, something invisible, but real. A whisper in the wind, perhaps, or the steady beat of purpose that came not from wealth, but from being seen, from being part of something greater than oneself. The heat of the day had given way to a cool evening breeze as the last orange light spilled over the rooftops of Athens. Deimos sat in the courtyard, sharpening the edge of a clay-cutting blade by lamplight. Nearby, Myrene folded linens, while Perion played with a handful of dried fig seeds, arranging them into the shape of a hoplite formation. It was a rare moment of peace. But then came the shouting. It started with a voice raised just beyond the house near the alley that led toward the central well. Then another deeper, angrier. A moment later, a crowd began to gather, their voices rising in frantic waves. Deimos set the blade down and stood. In Athens, noise after dark was rarely good. He stepped outside to see neighbors clustered around Thanos, the butcher whose shop stood 3 doors down. His apron was streaked with blood, but not all of it was animal. He broke in. Thanos was shouting. I caught him with his hands in the coin box. 2 men held a young boy by the arms, no older than 12, thin and pale. His eyes wild with panic. His tunic was torn, and he had a fresh cut across his cheek. I wasn't stealing, the boy sobbed. I was hungry. That's always the excuse, spat Thanos. And if we let him go, it'll happen again. Next time, it could be your house, the crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others looked away. Deimos felt his stomach twist. Who is he? Someone asked. Name's Nico, replied one of the men. Lives alone near the olive grove. Parents died last winter. The words hit Deimos like a stone. He had seen the boy once or twice, barefoot eyes sunken, hovering near the back of the market stalls. He had never spoken to him. Let the city courts deal with it, said an older neighbor. But Thanos shook his head. He's not a citizen, no father, no sponsor. The court won't waste time on him. The crowd was turning restless, split between pity and fury. Deimos stepped forward. Let me speak to him. Thanos glared. Why you want to take his punishment? No, said Deimos, but I want to understand. He knelt in front of Nico, whose chest heaved with uneven breaths. Is it true? Deimos asked. Did you take the coin? Nico's chin trembled. Only a few obols. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Deimos didn't need to hear more. He turned to Thanos. You sell meat every day. Couldn't you have spared a scrap? Thanos' face darkened. That's not the point. The law is the law. No, Deimos replied. The law is meant to protect. Sometimes that means protecting people from hunger before it becomes crime. The crowd went still. If we punish a child for starving, what does that say about us? There was silence. Then the older neighbor stepped forward. He can stay with me, he said slowly. For a while. Help in the garden. At least he won't steal. Thanos cursed under his breath, but relented. The men released Nico, who nearly collapsed into the arms of the old man. The crowd dispersed. Deimos returned home. Myrene was waiting at the gate. Did you fix it? No, he replied, but we may have stopped it from breaking further. Later that night, lying awake beside Myrene, Deimos stared at the ceiling. I wonder what kind of man Perion will become, he whispered. One who learns from his father, she said. But Deimos shook his head. One who learns to listen even when it's easier to shout. Outside, the stars blinked quietly over Athens. Somewhere a boy slept under a real roof for the first time in weeks. And somewhere deeper in the heart of the polis, a thread was mended, a thin, fragile thread that held the people together not by law, but by choice. Morning returned to Athens on a wind from the sea, brushing across terracotta roofs and stirring the olive trees into a slow dance. But this was no ordinary day. It was Hekatombion, the first month of the Athenian calendar, and with it came one of the most sacred days in the city, the festival of Athena Polias. For Deimos, it meant closing the shop, gathering his offerings, and climbing the hill of the Acropolis, along with thousands of others. But this year, he carried more than olive oil and incense. He carried questions. The walk to the Acropolis was slow. Streets were swollen with celebrants' families in clean chitons, vendors selling wreaths, priests draped in embroidered robes. Perion clutched Myrene's hand, eyes wide at the sight of a bull being led past by 2 flute players. Deimos followed with a small clay jar filled with sacred oil, freshly fired the surface, painted with a figure of Athena wielding her spear and aegis. As they approached the massive stone staircase that led to the Propylaea, the grand entrance to the sacred rock Deimos paused. From here, the city sprawled below like a living map. The agora, the Pnyx, the ship masts of Piraeus in the distance. But towering above all was the gleaming Parthenon white marble, blazing in the morning sun like something not made by human hands. Perion whispered, "Is that where she lives, in spirit?" Deimos said softly, "It's where we remind ourselves that we're not alone." Inside the temple precincts, the smell of incense thickened, and chants echoed off the stone. A line of citizens waited to leave their offerings at the altar. Deimos stepped forward and gently placed his jar among dozens of others, grain wine, honeycakes, garlands. He murmured a quiet prayer. He didn't ask for wealth, or strength, or even peace. He simply asked for clarity. But clarity doesn't always come from the divine. Sometimes it arrives in conversation. As Deimos exited the altar area, he found himself beside an old man in a scholar's robe, thin, sharp-eyed, with a short gray beard and a walking stick carved with tiny constellations. "You prayed with your head bowed," the man said. "A good sign. Means you don't assume the gods owe you anything." Deimos nodded, unsure whether to speak. "I'm Lysandros," the man said, "a teacher of philosophy, semi-retired, mostly tired." Deimos smiled. "I'm a potter. Excellent. Then you create things that last longer than speeches." They sat on a low wall near a fig tree overlooking the temple steps. Myrene and Perion had wandered toward the food stalls. Deimos took the chance to ask, "Do you believe she listens?" Athena Lysandros chuckled. "That depends. Do you mean listens the way a friend listens, or the way the wind does sometimes? Here sometimes, gone. I mean, do the gods care what happens to us?" Lysandros leaned back. "That's the oldest question in Athens, and no one answers it the same way. Some say the gods are just ideas, shadows we use to measure ourselves. Others say they walk among us in disguise. Me, I think it's both." Deimos was quiet. "I saw you speak at the Pnyx," Lysandros said, briefly. "But you spoke like a man who'd been ignored long enough to learn how to speak well." Deimos looked down. "I said what I felt, but it didn't change anything." "Didn't it?" Lysandros pointed toward a group of young men debating near a column. "One of them quoted you yesterday, called your words the voice of the clay." "Doesn't that count?" Deimos was stunned. Truly, Lysandros grinned. "In this city, words are seeds. Some take longer to grow." As the sun reached its peak, a procession passed through the sacred gate, a line of dancers, musicians, and a great peplos robe woven by priestesses over many months, held aloft like a banner. It shimmered with threads of gold and blue, depicting Athena's victory over the giants. People cheered. Horns sounded. The city remembered. Later, as Deimos walked home with Myrene and Perion, his feet sore but his heart oddly light, he looked up at the sky. The clouds were shifting into shapes he could almost read. He didn't believe the gods whispered directly into his ear. But he did believe in something larger than himself, something that tied the citizen to the city, the maker to the memory, the voice to the silence. Back at the house, Perion asked if he could draw Athena with charcoal on the back wall. Myrene laughed but nodded. As his son traced the helmeted goddess with black lines, Deimos watched in silence. Not every offering was made at an altar. Some were made at home, with hands, with fire, with faith. It began with the trumpet, distant, sharp, and unmistakable. Deimos froze as the sound cut across the late afternoon air, bouncing off the stone walls of the neighborhood like a thrown spear. He was kneeling at the kiln preparing to fire a new batch of amphorae, but now he stood dusting his hands on his tunic. The birds had gone silent. Even the children playing in the alley behind his home had stopped. The war drums had returned to Athens. Within the hour, a crier passed through the agora, reading from a scroll with a voice hoarse from repetition. All citizens under 40 must report to their tribe commanders by moonrise. Sparta's fleet is approaching the southern coast. This is not a drill. The assembly has decreed emergency mobilization. Deimos was no longer under 40, but that didn't mean he could ignore the storm. By evening, the city was a thrum of activity. Women packed bundles. Young men sharpened spears. The smiths worked by torchlight, their hammers ringing across the rooftops like thunder. Deimos walked home through the chaos, a jug of oil in one hand, his mind not on pottery, but on Perion. He found his son sitting in the courtyard, tying and retying a leather strap around his wrist. "You heard?" Deimos asked. Perion nodded, eyes downcast. "You're not old enough to fight," Deimos said gently. "I'm old enough to learn," Perion replied. And that terrified Deimos more than war itself. Myrene came out with a basket of bread and cheese, forcing a small smile. They've announced training drills at the Tholos. Just drills for now. But Deimos knew better. Athens never drilled unless war was breathing down its neck. That night, sleep refused to come. Deimos sat alone by the oil lamp, tracing the edge of an old helmet he kept beneath the stairs, a relic from his own campaign in the north many years ago. It was dented, dulled, and heavy with silence, like memory. He remembered the mud, the cold, the cries, the sound of arrows cutting through the air like whispered curses. He remembered watching men bleed out in the grass for a city they'd never see again. He had fought for democracy, for pride, for Athens. But mostly, he had fought to come home. Now, as the wind shifted through the shutters, he wondered what it all meant if the cycle never ended. In the morning, the streets were lined with citizens heading toward the training grounds. Perion begged to go watch, and Myrene reluctantly agreed. Deimos walked behind them, his mind half in the present, half adrift. At the Tholos, 100 young men stood in loose ranks, spears in hand-eyes, flickering with fear behind their bravado. A veteran officer barked commands, drilling them in formations. Deimos spotted one of his neighbors, Callias, trying to guide his trembling nephew into place. He nodded grimly at Deimos. Same madness. Different generation. They'll be lucky if it stays in drills, Deimos said. But they both knew better. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden wash over the city, Deimos took Perion to the docks. Warships were being loaded with supplies, olive oil grain, bronze-tipped spears. One of the ships bore the seal of the owl, Athena's symbol, its mast fluttering in the wind. Perion asked, "Will you go if they ask again?" Deimos stared at the ship. "I will go if I must. But you're old." He smiled sadly. "Old men still bleed, son, just more slowly." Parian didn't laugh. He looked at his father, truly looked, and perhaps for the first time saw the weight of Athens not as a story, but as a responsibility. That night, Deimos returned to his kiln. He pulled out a new amphora, freshly fired, and began to etch a scene onto its belly. It showed a man with a torch walking into the dark, not to fight monsters, but to keep the fire alive for others. Because war wasn't always about who held the sharpest blade. Sometimes it was about who kept building while the world burned. Night fell over Athens like a deep blue curtain, wrapping the city in the hush of 1,000 flickering oil lamps. The chaos of the day, the debates, the marketplace, the drills, the sacrifices had all settled into silence. Deimos sat in the small courtyard of his home, beneath an open square of sky, the stars beginning to punch through the darkness like embers in a vast hearth. He was alone now. Myrene had gone inside to rest. Parian, after hours of questions and thoughts too large for his young shoulders, had finally fallen asleep on the woven mat near the hearth. Deimos could hear his breathing steady and soft. The potter's hands were still dusted with clay. He hadn't washed. Something about the rawness of it, the dust, the fire, the work felt grounding. The world was changing around him. War was closer. The assembly was restless. And yet here in this pocket of quiet, he felt something older than all of it. Athens wasn't just the Pnyx or the Acropolis. It wasn't just philosophers and soldiers and merchants. It was men like him, whose names wouldn't be carved into marble, but whose fingers had shaped the cups people drank from, whose words had been heard by children at night, whose choices, small and private, wove the fabric of the city. He leaned back and stared at the stars. Somewhere out there, ships were moving under sail warriors, sharpening their blades, oracles whispering cryptic truths. But here in his modest courtyard was life. Honest, ordinary, imperfect. He thought about his father, long dead, a man who had taught him how to throw clay, how to fire a kiln, how to listen before speaking. Deimos had never asked him if he believed in the gods, but he remembered what the old man once said after a long day of work. "The gods may rule the sky, but we rule the hearth. And that's enough." Was it? In the far distance, the Parthenon glowed softly, moonlight catching on its white stone, like the ghost of a promise. A breeze drifted in from the sea, carrying with it the salt of the Aegean, the scent of olives, and the faintest hint of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Deimos stood and walked to the shelf beside the hearth. He pulled down the amphora he had finished days ago, a tall, elegant piece with Athena painted in profile, her spear raised not in violence, but in vigilance. He traced the outline with his fingertip and smiled. This he thought would last longer than he would. Someone someday would hold it, drink from it, or maybe just admire it on a shelf. And in that moment, Deimos would still be here, not in name, but in touch, in texture, in purpose. As he blew out the final lamp, he whispered not to the gods, but to the night itself. We are all just shaping clay. And in that simple truth, he found rest. And so ends a single day in the life of a man whose name you won't find in any scroll or monument. Deimos never led an army, wrote a treatise, or stood atop the steps of the Acropolis proclaiming wisdom to the masses. He was not a statesman nor a hero in battle. He was a potter, a husband, a father, a citizen. But perhaps that's exactly why his story matters. In every age, behind every golden statue and marble column, behind every revolutionary idea or battlefield victory, there are countless quiet lives, those who rise with the sun and work with their hands, who keep the world turning with little fanfare. Demos's Athens was made not just of philosophers and warriors, but of bakers, weavers, farmers, and craftsmen. It was their clay that built civilization, one amphora at a time. Through Demos, we remember that history is not just the record of the powerful, but the tapestry of the people. The man who taught his son to stand for something. The woman who kept the household lit with love and routine. The voices in the marketplace. The laughter in the alleys. The silence before sleep. These lives, though unsung, are eternal. And so, as the dust settles on the marble streets of ancient Athens, as the stars blink softly over the ruins we now admire from afar, we invite you to remember not just what was built, but who built it. Ordinary people living extraordinary days. Because sometimes living simply is the most profound legacy of all.